So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. So, yes, this will be, as you announced on the website, more reflection than a lecture. So it's reflection on some of the issues that I see as important for this common theme of borders and their role and significance. And yes, talking from the point of view of nationalism studies, I will talk first about nation-state borders. Then I will talk about symbolic or imaginary borders. In this case, focusing mostly on borders or boundaries between different national groups. And then I will raise this issue of kind of power of continuous power of ethno-nationalism. And I will focus on Europe in this talk, just to make it a little bit more simple. It's still a complex issue. And let me start by just stating the obvious, that we do not live in a borderless world, or even moving towards anything like that. And certainly we're not moving towards this dream of borderless Europe, although it seemed for a while when we were getting somewhat closer to this ideal. Now it's almost like the opposite process is taking place. So we all know all these examples of Brexit and, of course, increased border controls within Schengen area itself that's supposed to be free movement, and this is all response to the so-called migration crisis, as we like to label it, and the result of the widespread perception that the borders are threatened. So whether we talk about physical or imaginary boundaries, and those are, I guess, synonymous, I like to use the term boundaries, they are all, whether physical or geographic or symbolic in that sense, abstract, they are in any way setting limits to our discourses about ourselves and the world, and not only that, they limit and determine the ways we live our lives, where we can move or not. So I think that there is no human being in the world that's not affected by the fact that they live in a certain territory or belong to certain groups. So this is simply a reality. So if I talk first about kind of nation states and Europe and borders, there are two issues that come to my mind. They're somewhat separate. One is the issue that Yvan already raised, the external borders of Europe, and one is the issue of borders within Europe, so nation-state borders. And talking first, I mean, these are both very complex issues, but talking about the first one, what is Europe? Where does Europe end? That's, we know, like age-old question that's continuously open to discussion and interpretations, and it's really not simply a matter of geography at all. It's a very loaded question, and it's, if we look at not simply the fact that Europe is not really an island or a continent, but part of this Eurasian mass, basically the borders between what is Europe and what is Asia are invented through our history and civilization. But also, in a different sense, even if we look just at this relatively uncontested geographical area of Europe, we more or less know the definition. We have Mediterranean Sea, Bosphorus and Dardanelles, we have the Ural Mountains. Even if we take just that area, it's still, the issue is raised, what is European? And who there within these borders is European enough, or really European? So as we know, different areas of Europe have different history, economic and military power, and there are always these powerful discourses on what is European and what is not European. Within Europe, we're talking about Eastern Europe, of course, and the Balkans as those areas that are somehow always not European enough, right? So that's also another issue when it comes to these external borders of both geographic and idea of Europeanness. And then when I think about borders within Europe, the way we know them and accept them almost for granted today, they're fairly recent, all these nation-state borders, where they're basically the result of course, the aftermath of the two world wars, where they were, after that, they were agreed upon, and kind of 50 years after, they stayed more or less intact, which was seen as a prerequisite for peace. And during this 50 years of peace, this idea of unifying Europe was born. And then something almost opposite happened. So we had at the same time, the 90s of course came, and we had the collapse of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, so the borders of Europe the map of Europe changed once again, and this process of dissolution was running simultaneously with ideas of European unification, etc. So after that, many would still, with good reasons, argue that ethno-nationalism is continuously on the rise ever since, not only in this mentioned areas that we often label as the other Europe, but also in the center or in the West, like all these societies faced with the failure of multiculturalism as we see it today, or challenging migration processes, rising xenophobia, anti-Islamism, all this right-wing populism that's rising also, so all these processes. So, yes, that's why I brought this topic as one important one, the complexity of geographical borders. And these borders, as somewhat physical, are very complex, but still somewhat easier to comprehend than the symbolic boundaries, as they have in a sense a bit more reality. But they're also constructed, they're also historically produced and not given or natural, not ever just. They're fluid and contested, all these things we like to say in social sciences. And of course, if that's the case with them, then it's even trickier to discuss symbolic boundaries between different groups. And nevertheless, we still take those as well so often for granted and essentialize them and make them real, reify them, as Brubaker would say. So, in a sense, both of those types of borders are very much constructed, but they're also real in that sense that they influence people's lives, that they influence what we can and cannot do, say, and how we see ourselves and others. So, I will now specifically talk about those imagined or symbolic boundaries that divide people within Europe into different ethno-national groups, ethno-national us and them. So these are, of course, not the only way that people define themselves and others, but it's hard to argue that they remain salient and they're keep somehow coming to the front. So that brings me to question, like, what is the power of ethno-nationalism in 21st century Europe today? And I see nationalism as both the producer of borders, of course the cause of the borders, the boundaries being constructed, but also the result of borders. But it's always related to the issue of borders. I will argue that this ethno-national model of belonging still seems to be the dominant way that most people in Europe conceive their own identities and identities of others. And in that sense, Europe today is certainly not moving beyond the ethno-national. And if we, look back at the 80s and 90s, there were all these ideas among researchers and scholars that there was demise of nation-state is coming, and nation-state will lose its centrality, both as center of power and unit of research, but that hasn't really happened. And ethno-nationalism also keeps framing academic approaches very much, as well as, of course, political reality. So these debates about group identity, about nationality, and the right to belong to different European states still dominate political and media agendas. So it's omnipresent. And what would be, I think, most surprising to those that were dreaming of this demise of nation-state is that the current dominating arguments in these societies still keep revolving around these ideologies of blood and soil. That keeps being prominent and accepted and not challenged enough, and we have strongly accentuated nativist and sedentarist arguments. And sedentarism is this discourse that naturalizes the link between people and place. So yes, it's all these claims are result, I think, of complex interplay of this racialized and ethnicized discourses that remain powerful guidelines in the way we are all socialized still to different European societies today. And yes, in that sense, I mean, I'm coming to my conclusions, and one of them is that this ethno-national thinking is so ingrained in discourse, not only whatever we talk about, vernacular, political, even academic, that people reproduce this type of thinking whether they are aware of it or not. And the identities we all negotiate for ourselves and others always somehow have to take into account such facts and social constructs as origin, place of birth, ethnicity, religion, race, nation. And I would like to refer here how the Norwegian anthropologist Marianne Gastaut in 2006 noted how many people in Europe, especially young people with minority backgrounds, she thought, they seriously doubted they will be ever accepted as real citizens. And there's this process she identifies, I really like this term, re-ethnification of the nation taking place. And she says, although European societies are complex and pluralist, at the same time, boundaries of belonging are re-articulated and reaffirmed by the majority. And I agree with her here. So basically, why all these ideologies, why is ethno-nationalism still so powerful? And I actually see its power not at all in this claim that it's kind of back with power and vengeance, that it's exploding. Not at all. I think that those kinds of extreme manifestations of nationalism are, they're there, but they're relatively marginal, let's say, or less prominent than what I see as, let's call it, commonsensical nationalism, which is, I think, why nationalism retains its power, because its power is precisely in this banality, in the fact that it's constantly just below the surface, so it's easy to bring it back to the surface when it's needed, and it's taken for granted as just the main rule of the game. That's how things are, so it even goes without being noticed. And I will quote again authors Suni and LA, they say that it is underpinning the social order without requiring much thinking. So nationalism is often equated with these extreme political parties, but we keep forgetting and overlook the degree to which national symbols permeate the lives of ordinary people and the way they reproduce all this. So another kind of possible guess to why all these processes are still so prominent is that, of course, I mean, it sounds obvious, complexity is hard to deal with, and so people like to oversimplify and make these clear-cut categories. So that's one thing, and of course there's also fear as a factor. So we have this culture of fear and threat, fear of difference, change, fear of losing privilege or way of life. So that's all also the reason why there's all these processes of re-ethnification going on. So the appeal of ethno-nationalism is that we see our resources are limited and we're trying to protect somehow our own right to it, our group's right to it. So in that sense, immigrants, of course, appear as a particular challenge to this European national myths that have at its core this myth of the common past, origin, and blood. And then migrants are seen as invading our space, as guests in our house. All these metaphors we can read in any comments to any online article dealing with them, or even worse than that, parasites, invaders, threat, etc. So, in that sense, this cosmopolitan post-national ideal is lost its power because it's basically it can be seen as elitist and with no touch to with reality. So, yes, we need these limitations and borders, both were categories, to function in reality and also to discuss in academia, but the problem is, I see it when they're taken for granted, where basically, of course, nationalism had its emancipatory and modernizing role 1.5 centuries ago, but ever since then we seem to be just taking it for granted. We became hostages of that kind of nation thinking, so I think that's still what's going on, but yes, guess there could be different opinions. So I'll end here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.